I want to start by welcoming everyone to an event hosted by Ethics and International Affairs, which is a journal of the Carnegie Council, and which provides the spark or the inspiration for the panel that we're hosting today. The panel comes out of a special issue of Ethics and International Affairs with a collection of essays by academics on the problems of reconstructing and repairing liberal democracies. With an eye to the issues and challenges documented in the various essays in that issue, we wanted to put together a panel that drew upon both a multinational and a multidisciplinary kind of expertise to discuss the practical ways on the ground in which actors in democratic countries around the world are attempting and striving to renew and rebuild their democratic institutions after a brush or worse with authoritarianism. I'm honored to be joined in this discussion by three panelists. I'm going to introduce them very briefly, and I apologize that I'm not offering the extensive details that their biographies warrant. The Carnegie Council has more elaborate and properly detailed biographies on their webpage. Our first panelist is Bhavani Fonseka, who is a human rights lawyer and senior researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives, which works to achieve a liberal, democratic Sri Lanka. Our second panelist is James Sasso, who recently served as the senior investigative counsel for the US House of Representatives January 6th committee, where he worked on the connection between domestic extremism and the storming of the US Capitol. And Oscar Vilhena Vieira, who is the dean of the Getulio Vargas Foundation School of Law in Sao Paulo. He is an expert in constitutional law and politics in Brazil. The format of today's panel will be that I will start by asking our panelists a couple of very general questions which I hope set the scene, and invite them to offer their expertise with respect to their particular countries and their own perspective and experience. And at about 45 minutes past the hour, I will look to our feed from Zoom for questions, and I encourage all those attending to use the chat feature to submit questions for our panelists, and I'll try and wrap as many of those up in that last 15 minutes of the conversation. So maybe if I can start by asking each of you what I think is a very big question, and I'm going to push you to offer a pithy answer, given the timing of our panel. What do you think? What do you think the symptoms are in the country in which you focused on most closely? What do you think the underlying dynamics, the symptoms are that are exacerbating threats to democracy today? So if you had to pick one or two of those, what might you focus on? Perhaps I can start with Bhavani and then go on to James and Oscar.
Thank you, Aziz, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I'll speak very much from my experience in Sri Lanka and the many challenges we faced in upholding the rule of law and protecting democracy in the last couple of years, I would say, has really tested us. And in that, one of the key dynamics that I would say is one of the biggest challenges is when power is centered around one individual or one institution. And in Sri Lanka, it's the executive presidency, which has very limited checks and balances. And in the last couple of months, really, we have seen the crisis, the economic crisis that's been reported in the media, very much linked to the powers of this office. So when power is centered around one arm of government and one institution, that carries immense dangers. And one of the things that really, in a functioning democracy, is to have the checks and balances to ensure that there's oversight, there's accountability, there's transparency, all of those issues that are required to fully function. So it's that's one dimension to ensure that power is shared. The other, I will say very quickly, is this kind of complacency that a strong man can address all of these issues. And that's across the board, from Asia to Africa to Latin America, the strong man mindset. So those narratives also are very, very dangerous in terms of a functioning democracy.
Thank you, Bhavani. James, can I bring you in? So Bhavani's identified institutional and cultural dynamics and problems. How would you characterize the causes of the problem in the US from your perspective?
Well, thank you, Aziz, and thank you to the Carnegie Council for having me. In the US, we traditionally have held ourselves above having these sorts of problems about democratic backsliding. But part of what we did on the January 6th committee is to look at exactly why we are experiencing those problems today. So if I had to pick one or two symptoms, because there really are a lot of things going on, I'd start with what I call declining faith in American political institutions. So a lot of the defendants and rioters we interviewed talked not just about a stolen election, which in its own sense is a sign of broken faith in our political institutions if you're not willing to believe that you could lose an election. But they talked about things that started well before even Donald Trump took the stage. So a government that wasn't really working for everybody. People who felt left behind by policies that left them jobless, or that they felt other people were unfairly getting ahead of them. And obviously there's a lot of racism or racial animosity, or whatever you want to call it, tied up in a lot of these feelings. But I think overall, if you have a system where people just don't believe that government is working for them, it is very easy for a demagogic strongman, as Bhavani was talking about, to come in and take advantage of those insecurities and to say, I believe you. You are right. This government is not working for you. So let's do something about it. Let's put me in power. Let's put my party in power. And we do have a national party here that has been willing to take advantage of those insecurities and to politically benefit from them, even though they aren't doing much to address the root causes of those insecurities. And that problem has lots to do with polarization, which I'm happy to talk about more. And it's impossible to say it's one thing, but I think a lot of our symptoms tie into that overarching lack of faith.
Thanks, James. I think that nicely builds upon the second point that Bhavani mentioned and amplifies the cultural aspect of the problem. I should just pass on the message that our organizers at the Carnegie Council have put into the chat, which is to say that if the four of us should be cognizant that if we're not speaking, we should mute our mics, which I know I was failing to do. I'm with apologies that you're at the end, Oscar. Can I turn to you for your perspective on causes or symptoms with respect to the challenges to Brazilian democracy?
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to participate in this debate. Thank you for the invitation. Well, Brazil emerged in a major political and economic crisis after 2013. Democracy was very stable. We were very optimistic in relation of changes that were happening in Brazil. However, mass demonstrations in the streets since 2013 was a sign that something was wrong, that impacts the behavior of institutions. We had the impeachment of President Dilma. We have a mass corruption investigation that ended up with the prison of former President Lula. And this instability culminated with the election of a far-right authoritarian populist. So I think the Brazilian case demonstrates that instability, distrust in the institution opens the space for the election of a populist. But what are the roots of this crisis that we saw? I think there are some institutional roots that we can debate. In the case of Brazil, one is the tension inserted in our political system. We have a presidential system with a multi-party system, which is the most fragmented. Today we have 31 parties in Congress. So every president that is elected must create a coalition, and this coalition can cost a lot. And I think several of the corruption scandals that we saw after 2013 that foment the political crisis are related with the cost of maintaining a coalition that support government. So costs a lot to govern in Brazil. Depends in some sense of how you produce this coalitions. And Brazil has a very independent legal system. So the conflict between a political system that depends in unorthodox corrupt practice and a legal system that became very independent. So it's the shock of the powers, the shock between politics and law. This is one point. And the second point is obviously the question of the unfulfilled promises of democracy in terms of well-being. So you have in one side of the Brazilian society a lot of frustration in terms of improvement of their quality of life. But however, the 25 years of democracy also made changes that are unpleasant to other parts of the population. So you have resentment. So the paradox here is that you have the left, the young, very frustrated because democracy did not produce an immense improvement in their lives. However, you have the conservatives, those who live in the rural areas, those who are more religious, very with a strong resentment for social change, for the racial recognition, for women improvement. So I think it's a paradoxical moment where the crisis is direct related with this conflict of frustration from one side and resentment for the other side.
Thank you so much, Oscar. Let me build upon the three perspectives that we've seen by asking a question that juxtaposes two ways of moving forward. One way would be to say that we need to reform existing institutions. So that's a question of recalibrating perhaps at the edges. The alternative would be a more radical revision or a more radical transformation of existing institutions. And what I want to ask is, where on that dichotomy, or if you prefer, where on that spectrum do you think ideally your countries, Sri Lanka, the US, and Brazil, where ought they to be? And let me draw out something that's in all of your answers as a way of thinking about the reform versus radical transformation question, which is I hear two kind of diagnoses in what people have said. The first is that our institutions are flawed, So that suggests that you need to change something about the design of the institutions. And then second, there's a cultural argument, where the cultural argument in that a couple of you have expressed is about the way that a political system deals with disappointments of different kinds. And I that makes me wonder whether the problem here is not the institutions, whether the problem here is not the outcomes, but whether it's actually people's expectations. That in a democracy, people will always be disappointed. Change will always be incremental. There will always be winners and losers, and even the winners will not feel like they won enough. And it's very easy in that context for the strong man to take that disappointment and leverage it. And if that's right, then I'm not sure if that pushes you toward reform or whether it pushes you toward radical transformation. But it does seem a rather deep problem for a democracy to deal with. So maybe this time I can start with James and then go to Oscar and Bhavani, just to mix up the not have everyone go in the same order again.
I'm happy to. I'm sorry, there is some. I have no idea what that noise is outside, so if you hear that, I apologize. Aziz, I think that's a great point about expectations. And in a democratic system, you will always have, in some sense, winners and losers, because some people have to give a little more than others. But the idealist in me thinks that you can minimize that disappointment to enough so that people aren't as susceptible to a demagogic leader. If you flatten out the benefits so that society is more or less working for everybody, if people are secure and economically, if people can access childcare, if people don't believe that their neighbor is getting more benefits than they are, you can hopefully minimize that disappointment. I don't think you can ever get rid of it. So I'm more on the reform side of institutions. I still hold on to the Madisonian belief that we can take this diverse country with all a multitude of factions, as he put it, and force them together in a governmental system that requires compromise and not all-out winning. Part of the problem in that ideal view is the way that our government is structured. Is it has incentivized us to have a bipolar party system, which two-party systems can be fine. Most people are generally moderate, and politicians would end up having to move to the middle to get more votes, which brings about compromise. But for the last 50 years, and I think this partially has to do with disappointment, once our democracy started expanding to actually believing in equality for all people and not just white men, it brought a lot of resentment that social benefits were going to others. So you see in the late 60s and 70s, this beginning of a trend towards polarization that has to do with resentment on one end, economic inequality that leaves a lot of people behind. As Oscar was talking about, the costs of doing politics in America requires politicians to get money. They get money from the more extreme voices. Institutional changes to how elections are run. All of these things have built up so that our institutions, instead of working as we could hope they would be, which is towards compromise and deliberation, have pulled apart and have become stuck. And at the same time, we have technological changes that are also driving people apart, which doubles down on that resentment and doubles down on that anger and what we call negative or affective polarization in this country. And a lot of the defendants we interviewed, a lot of the rioters I tracked, were very open about the fact that they saw Democrats, liberals, quote unquote social elite as actual enemies of the country. It's hard to believe that reforming institutions can do anything about people who want to start a civil war, but I think you have to start there, and you have to have the institutions actually work and move forward to minimize that resentment you were talking about.
Thanks, James. Can I turn things over to you, Oscar, and ask the same reform versus more radical transformation question? Oscar, I'm sorry, I think you have to turn off your mute. Sorry.
I'm sorry. So I'm certainly on the side of incremental reforms, and this for two main reasons. First of all, the Madisonian institutions that organize the Brazilian political system certainly function against the strongman. Bolsonaro made much less damage than we expected. First of all, because this same multi-party system that created the malaise of the political system in the first moment was very helpful to contain him in the second moment. Also, the Supreme Court played an enormous role in containing Bolsonaro. In fact, what we have here was much more a case of infralegal authoritarianism, because he was not able to approve an amendment or a major law to bend Brazilian democracy. So he abused of his administrative prerogatives. So in one sense, the very consensual constitutional system that Brazil has was sufficient to contain larger damages. So this is one reason we have to ameliorate the system, we have to reform it, but it functions against a very undemocratic and hostile to constitution. The second is a more philosophical question of our times. Is it possible to open a constitutional assembly in a moment to make a great reform? I don't think so. The costs are immense, mostly in a very polarized environment. I think what we are seeing in Chile, or what we saw in Europe in the beginning of the 21st century, shows that it's much more difficult to do a larger, profound reform in these constitutional structures in the 21st century than it was in the 19th century, where you put 60 farmers, white people, to discuss their differences. Now it's much harder. So I think we should really re-emphasize a notion of constitutional resilience, being very tough and in terms of protecting the core structures of democracy, and being much more flexible in terms of reforming the policies. So this, I think, is how we should move in the 21st century, being bound to the basic structures of democracy and being flexible in terms of changing new strategies for policies to deal with your sense of discontentment. So here is where we produce the change.
Thank you very much, Oscar. And just to flag, there's a book on the very issue of constitutional conventions that Oscar just touched upon, that was released in the US just a couple of months ago by former Senator Russ Feingold, that takes a very similar view and does a very nice job of recounting some of the factors that Oscar just identified in the US context. And if I can find the link to that, I'll throw it. I'll flag the name of the book. Bhavani, can I turn to you with the same question? Reform, radical transformation, disappointment of the people.
And thanks. And I think I'll go back to something you raised, Aziz, in terms of expectations. I think people want quick fixes, quick results, and in a post-COVID context, there is this whole thing about who was able to deliver, especially in the global South. I would say these different narratives, did democracy really provide us the answers, or was it overrated? And at least in Sri Lanka, I would say, there was this expectation that results come, or, when something is delivered, people go with that answer. So, just looking at our own history, there was this great expectation democracy could deliver in addressing post-conflict, post-war results, could address the economic situation. And really, it's just taken a huge toll on Sri Lanka and on the society. And there's great disappointment that institutions that are there are not delivering. So in 2019, as you know, this with the presidential election, a very populist leader was elected. Now, this is not just for Sri Lanka. I mean, we are seeing that global trend of populism coming in and being a direct threat to democracy. But that said, you know, Oscar's point about resilience, I think that's also very important to remember that in the last couple of months, particular checks and balances in terms of an independent judiciary, civil society, media, elections, they have all tested in different ways and shown us at least democracy can be very messy. Expectations need to be managed, but democracy finally does deliver. So it's also managing expectations, but also really thinking in a post-COVID context. What are the things that we should also be looking at for kind of into the future? Whether it be strengthening institutions, citizens' role, and in this, I will end with this. In Sri Lanka, we were in the precipice of authoritarianism. We're still struggling with that, with this present crisis, but the citizen took control, went to the streets peacefully, largely, and deposed of a very popular leader who brought the country to economic crisis. Now, for that, you need to have a citizen who is also willing to robustly but peacefully challenge any notions of threats to democracy. So I think there are different things to look at, but it's end of the day, it's extremely important that the citizen is also aware of what's possible and what are the tools to protect democracy.
Thank you very much for that sobering and helpful reflection. Can I turn now to the question of actors in processes of democratic reform or rehabilitation? And I think I'm going to start with Oscar and then go to Bhavani and then James. And let me frame the question as a extension or as jumping off from the last thing that Bhavani said, which is that a key actor in a process of democratic reform or reconstruction is the citizenry. And I want to ask whether is that the place to look for the energy for democratic reform, or do we look to other institutions, the intermediating institutions that Tocqueville identified, for example, and that Oscar mentioned when he discussed the robustness of democratic life during the Bolsonaro period as a consequence of the persistence of the multi-party arrangement? Or do we look to non-democratic bodies? Again, to pick up on something Oscar said, perhaps unelected judiciaries have a role. And perhaps they have a role in Brazil that they may or may not have in the United States. So where is the energy for democratic reform coming from? Or if you prefer, how do the different actors that almost certainly will be involved, some of them popular, dispersed, some of them elite and concentrated, who's taking the leadership, who's following? How's that dynamic working out in your jurisdiction? So, Oscar, if I can turn to you, this very much, I think, is bringing in something that you've already put on the table, but inviting you to extend it.
Well, Obviously, I would not be able to answer such a question, but my impression from Brazil is that most of the crisis is a consequence of the crisis of the intermediaries, is lack of trust in the political parties, is lack of trust in the media, lack of trust in science and universities. This is part of populism. Populism raised because of some problem with the intermediary. And I think this is general in any major democracy. What is the role of social media and how it impacts these intermediaries? However, when we look at the resistance to populism in Brazil, at least, and now I'm being very specific about the Brazilian case, I think the change maker here was civil society in the moments that, in the peak of hostility of Bolsonaro against institutions, basically the elections and the courts, several important sectors of civil society, I'm saying financial system, industry, labor unions, very radical left-wing movements, they sit together and say, we have our differences that are enormous. Normally we are in conflict. However, we sit in the same side of the table when we are discussing democracy and constitution. So I think this obviously revigorated the civil society tissue in Brazil. So I think, yes, the energy, the most resilient energy came from civil society. This is one aspect. The second aspect comes from the institutions. I think the notion that everyone would lose made it possible for the creation, one, of a large re-coalition with Lula on the head. But if you had his vice president as a central right figure, so it was possible because civil society said democracy is innegotiable. The political actors felt a space for creating a political alliance that was important. And also there is a problem with the non-majoritarian institutions. So in Brazil, the judiciary and the military that were disputing in some way the leadership of the moderating power. And clearly what civil society and political parties indicated is that in a democracy, the military would not be acceptable as a moderating, with a moderating function. So I think it is the connections between those who normally do not dialogue. So to really have the financial system, the industry, the unions, the social movements capable of dialogue. Here, I think, is the energy of the transformation, and it will be the energy for the renovation of democracy. Aziz, we are not hearing you.
I apologize. I was muted myself. I believe I think in order to shift around the order in which people speak in, Bhavani should go next and then James.
Okay, and Aziz, the same question as Oscar?
Absolutely, same question. Who are the actors, or how do they work together? Where does the energy come from? Whatever combination of that approach you would like to take.
So I think there are different actors that need to be factored in. I mean, I mentioned this before. The citizen is critical, and if the citizen doesn't take charge and hold the elites accountable, that's going down a very scary path. And in Sri Lanka, at least, the citizens stood up last year and pushed back very peacefully, but pushed back and kind of reclaimed that space in terms of a functioning democracy. I will also say the opposition, and the opposition there are different elements in that, the political opposition, but different voices, trade unions, civil society, And I think that's critical to have those actors robustly engage in debate, peacefully engaging. I mean, I'm not talking about violent means, but the other is and Oscar mentioned this, is to ensure that the military, the public service play their role. I mean, we haven't seen this so much as opposed to other countries, but you know, if you have the scary prospect of the military taking over and encroaching into democratic spaces and processes, that's a very scary prospect. So it's extremely important that the different actors play their role and not encroach into other areas that really can undermine democracy. Finally, I will also say media, social media, they have a critical role in terms of information, responsible reporting, all of that. Fake news has a very scary way of threatening democracy, and this is something to really look at. And the final actors is independent institutions, them playing that role. The judiciary, for example, has played a key role in Sri Lanka over the years in upholding the constitution, in having a check on executive power. Certain times they have failed, but you know, we are going to court. I mean, I'm a practicing lawyer, but as citizens, we seek court remedy because we see certain arbitrary actions by the executive. So, you know, independent institutions also have a very, very important role that needs to be recognized. So different actors, different energies that come from them, but so important that they all play that particular role in terms of a functioning, but sometimes fragile democracy.
Thank you very much. Can I turn things over to James, and just to flag what I think we will do after James has spoken is to turn to some of the questions. And what I will aim to do with the questions is to be a little selective and pick out questions which all the panelists can respond to and as a priority. And then if we have time, which I doubt, we'll turn to the things that are focused upon one panelist's expertise.
Great. I don't know if I have a great answer to this question or anything more insightful than Bhavani or Oscar have already said. So I'll just focus a little bit on the observations that we pulled out of our investigation. It can be difficult right now in America to believe in this sort of citizenry energy aspect that reform will come from the bottom up. I think, you know, ideally in any democratic system, you wouldn't be able to do anything unless the people wanted it done. But I tend to be a bit of an institutionalist and believe that institutions can and are really the primary actors of what drive people's beliefs. So, and I'm a bit concerned about where our civil energy is in America right now. We have a lot of political violence, you know, a lot of militia groups out there, and it's not just a right-wing thing. There are leftist groups that are also willing to engage in political violence. As I mentioned earlier, our citizens are tending to see people who disagree with them not as fellow citizens with whom they can have a discourse, but anonymous online identities that they're willing to say that they hate and willing to commit violence to. That is not the kind of energy that I believe will lead to, as you wrote about, front sliding. You know, political violence is definitely not the way there. That doesn't mean I blame people necessarily. I think our institutions in a lot of ways have not done a great job. Think about the incentives that have driven our national media attention to go after certain more extreme voices, because that's what gets the most clicks, instead of focusing on local issues and local conversations where people still have a lot of agreement. It's you know, I think thankfully our courts held after the 2020 election and prevented all of those challenges from moving forward. Thankfully, a couple of secretaries of state, local Republican election officials were willing to do the right thing. there's still an energy of people that prevented rioters like Doug Mastriano and election deniers like Carrie Lake from winning local, very important elections in states in 2022. So there is, I'm still hopeful that there is enough energy of the people that believe in democracy first to hopefully blunt some of the problems moving forward. I just think that if we don't start working on our institutions, we might get overwhelmed by the negative energy that they are in part causing.
Great, thank you very much to all the panelists. Let me put on the table. I will go through the questions that are general in the order that I see them coming in the chat, and really invite any one of you to speak to this. So the first question is we've talked about people who members of the public who feel quote unquote left behind by their democratic system. And the question is do you think in your context that those people are justified? And I guess the further question is, do you think that varies between different countries? And just to put a point or link it back to the discussion we've just been having, do you think it would matter if the feeling of being left behind is or is not justified? Does the fact of justification change the strategies that one adopts to reform and rebuild democracies? That is, if people feel left behind and they're justified, you do one set of things. But if people feel left behind and they're unjustified, you do a different set of things. So I'm not going to call on anybody, and I'm going to invite you just to leap out and speak, and I'll play traffic cop if needed.
Okay, you're going to put all the questions or one by one?
I think, Oscar, what I'll do is I'll ask a couple of questions, but I'll try and wrap a couple of them together. But why don't we try that one, and then if one person would like to respond to that, that's great. Then we can turn to the next question.
Okay, if no one's, I just would. It's interesting in the Brazilian case that the most radicalized and those who really confront institutions were not exactly the left behind. So were mostly those who have a resentment for what has changed in Brazilian society. So it were the more conservative and wealthier who were the ones hostile to democracy, to what has changed. So it's interesting that even though there is a very inefficacious democracy that did not provide really improvement on the wealth of the poorest of the poor, they were not the ones who really revolt against democracy. So this is, I don't know if it's the peculiarity, but the most radical groups were those who were left behind in a different sense, not the economic one, but mostly on the moral sense of desiring is a kind of society that Brazil was departing from it. So I'm just this is my only reaction, that we shouldn't create a symmetry between those who are left behind and those who are disloyal with democracy. It's not exactly like this.
And if I could jump in and build off of that, just on thinking about the people who stormed the Capitol, I think we need to define what we mean by left behind, because we had a mixture of professionals who are certainly not economically left behind in the same sense as a person who lost his job during COVID and went down a radical QAnon rabbit hole and then decided to believe the election was stolen and he needed to protect Donald Trump to save the country. So we do have, there's left economically, and as Oscar was saying, we have a different version of left behind. Now, the idea that one is more justified than the other, maybe, right? Like if you're feeling left behind for reasons of racism, that's not really justified. I'm sorry. But even people who are economically well off can feel left behind in a different sense if they feel that they are shouldering the burdens of society through tax policies that take nearly half their paycheck, while Jeff Bezos walks around paying $0 in taxation. That's a different kind of left behind. I can still make them feel isolated out of the way the government works. So it's hard to say, that would be justified necessarily. It's definitely not justified in storming the Capitol, right? There's no justification to political violence, in my view, outside the absolute crazy extremes of dictatorial systems. But in terms of like a justified feeling of being left behind, there, sure, being economically left behind is one thing that we can say is justified. Does it change our strategy? It probably should. It probably means that there is some policies that we can change to make those people feel left behind. Other kinds of resentments and feeling left behind for moral reasons, or just the fact that society is moving forward at a certain pace that you don't like, or including people that you don't like. I'm a little more hesitant to say that policies can really ameliorate that, other than encouraging people to live with those who are not like them from a young age. But that's more like social manipulation than policy.
Great. Unless Bhavani wants to speak, let me put the next question that I see queued up to all of you. And I think there's a couple of different ways of interpreting this, but let me put it in its most general way. So the question is that, look, this is a moment of great mistrust. There's lots of what the questioner calls conspiracism, misinformation around. And a lot of that is focused upon our democratic institutions. This raises the question as to how does one rebuild trust, which I think the questioner takes as being necessary to democracy, at a moment when there is this intense distrust of democratic institutions that would preclude them from being the leaders in regenerating the trust that's necessary for democracy. So how do you go about rebuilding trust in an age of mistrust focused on democratic institutions?
Can I come in here? Yeah. So I mean that's a question, and I think you can have a separate session, but maybe just throw some quick comments. Is this whole thing about mistrust and showing that democracy or the institutions and for that there are results. There's also a media that's independent and able to report. Also managing, I think we've all spoken to about managing expectations, what's possible in the short term, in the long term. But end of the day, why do people have such limited trust? And there's a trust deficit is because we've been seeing such a decay in institutions, in the elites. And I think it comes back to this fundamental question of, where does power lie? Whose interests are the elites kind of acting? So really asking some very, very kind of tough questions and holding a lot of them accountable. So, in a way, the different listening to the panel and just kind of looking at global trends, it's such an important time to take stock of things that have worked. And I'll in this with what in Sri Lanka, at least, we had a constitution coup in 2018. We had a crisis, unprecedented. Sri Lanka is bankrupt as a result. In all of it, however messy it got, key institutions stood strong, were resilient, and the citizenry stepped up at those very difficult moments. So I think it's also important to look at some of the success stories and realize that in some of the toughest moments, they do respond as long as there's something to function in these difficult times. So, and to build trust, I think one needs to look at some of the positive elements. So maybe I'll end there.
maybe very simply just to follow up on that. Oh, Aziz, I didn't know if you're muted, but yeah, I think that's right. If if people see government actually working, and in the United States at the national level, our government has been pretty stalemated and stuck and rusted for a while now, and that leads to a lot of unilateral actions by the president, and those tend to be on hot button policy issues that 50% of the country likes and 50 don't. So I think if people saw or could refocus on what their local governments were doing, what their state governments are doing, and also what their national government was doing positively for them. I mean, it's even hard for the federal government to sell the good things it does right now because everyone's just talking about the negative. I think that would go very far.
Oscar, any reflections and conclusion from you?
I agree with my colleagues. I think effectivity of the government, working across the aisle. I think in federal states, if you have the capacity to federal, local governments working together across the aisle, it's very interesting to address real problems, not counting with the ideological lines. And also, I think we have to deal with the most radical discourses and how they are potentialized in social media. So I know it's an anathema in the US freedom of expression debate. However, taking a more environmentalist approach to the issue of freedom of expression, at least to those who are harm discourse in terms of discrimination and anti-democratic, I think is something really that regulation should be implemented. So, because distrust is fomented and potentialized, and we have to deal with this. I just don't see how we can close our eyes to this dimension.
You're muted, Aziz.
Sorry, let me close by thanking our three panelists, Bhavani, James, and Oscar, for their rich and provocative reflections from really the front lines of three countries that have faced democratic backsliding head on. I'd encourage everyone to access a recording of this event by visiting the carnegiecouncil.org website and to take a look at the special issue of Ethics and International Affairs that provoked it. So thank you to all for you participating and attending, and we look forward to seeing you at another Carnegie Council event.
Thank you so much.